Evolution isn't true.
Says who?
Your mom.
What?
Well, mitochondrial DNA is passed on from our moms. And while evolutionists say that human evolution started about 100,000 years ago, some controversial mitochondrial DNA says that it may have started much more recently.
I'm not exactly sure what controversial mitochondrial information he's talking about. They're all being very vague in every one of these clips, but scientists don't say that human evolution started 100,000 years ago, or that even Homo sapiens came about 100,000 years ago. Homo sapiens seemed to evolve from the other great apes in Africa about 300,000 years ago. But prior to that, there were other human-like, and since we're all apes, ape-like ancestors. The genus Homo actually can be found going back as far as 2.8 to 2.75 million years ago. At least that's the earliest fossil evidence that we have. Now, as far as this mitochondrial evidence that he's talking about, I don't understand where he's going with this, because the mitochondrial Eve that is normally touted out by creationists, that individual lived around 155,000 years ago, so it's even farther back than he's trying to suggest. But still, that doesn't represent the first female. That's just how far back can we trace our mitochondrial lineage, and that one individual is the farthest that we can trace back. Not that they were the first Homo sapien female, just that that's the farthest we can trace it back.
Well, they showed that the observed DNA mutation rates actually point back to the first woman about 6,500 years ago.
For one thing, this entire idea right here that these mutation rates only point to like 6,000 years ago as far as humans developing, that makes literally no sense. For one thing, it assumes a stable mutation rate, and mutation rates have not always been stable. They fluctuated throughout time. Also, the entire premise that there's just not enough time for the mutations to happen just totally ignores how mutations actually occur. They ignore the fact that mutations can happen in parallel, so it's not like you have to have one right after the other, right after the other. They can happen in one group of organisms, and then that group of organisms merge with another group of organisms, and through genetic drift and other sexual selection type of interactions between these groups, one group can develop one particular mutation, another group can develop another mutation, and when those two groups merge, they produce an individual that has both mutations. Now, that's just one possibility. There's multiple different possibilities for how all of these mutations can accumulate over time. But to say that the mutation rate only gets us back to 6,000 years ago, let's put that into perspective. The human race didn't start with organized agriculture until about 11,000 years ago. So saying that, the mutation rate only gets us back to 6,000 years, I'd have to see your work on that. And they're not providing any citations. So what can be dismissed without any kind of evidence and is thoroughly refuted with current evidence can be easily dismissed.
Well, the Science Journal is also saying that evolutionists are more concerned with a faster mutation rate, probably because contradicts human evolution.
No, it's not that we need a fast mutation rate. It's the fact that we've observed a variable mutation rate, and that there are various ways in which multiple mutations can pile up over time and end up changing a species either rapidly or slowly over a period of time. Now, just keep in mind that the Homo genus came onto the scene 2.8 million years ago. And so there's been 2.8 million years of evolution, and Homo sapiens first appeared 300,000 years ago. So you're talking about like 2.5 million years of evolution between when the Homo genus first appeared and 300,000 years ago. That's a lot of adaptation. That's a lot of generations. That's a lot of sexual selection. That's a lot of natural selection. But you see, here's what they're not telling you, is that because the mutation rates are variable and that multiple mutations can happen simultaneously or independently of each other and then later combine in order to produce a more survivable organism, like all of those things are problems for the creationist model. What they need is that 6,000 year time frame. So whenever they look at the evidence, like the mitochondrial evidence or anything like that, of course they're going to come up with a 6,000 year timeline. Of course they're going to make assumptions that are just outrageous to make. Like the primary assumption that most creationists make, that organisms are not related to each other, like different organisms. Of course, creationists are not going to agree that whales were once land animals. But the fossil evidence that we have shows that they were once land animals. And there's existing evidence in the skeletal structure of whales and dolphins and other animals in that particular clade, because they still have those rear hind legs that sort of sprout off of their back end. Those are vestigial limbs. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't found some kind of use for them now, but it does mean that they were once used in a completely different way for legs. Why would a whale need legs? Well, it makes sense if they were once land animals. Of course, these are uncomfortable facts for creationists. They are the ones that need the evidence to work out in a certain way. Normal people that accept evolution for the fact that it is, we just have to work with the information that's just there in nature. We take it however it comes. We don't have to manipulate data. That's what creationists do.
Well, these discoveries have even contributed to the development of new research guidelines used by the FBI in forensic investigations. But I'd say it's mere coincidence that these ages coincide with the Bible. Or is it?
I don't know what kind of guidelines that she's talking about. I don't know. They're just being so vague about everything that it seems nonsensical. Like, how would the FBI producing guidelines based on some kind of research out there, how would that affect the mountains of evidence that we have for evolution? The answer is that it doesn't. It doesn't affect it. Whatever kind of guidelines the FBI could come up with whatever kind of research that they're talking about is still not going to affect the evolutionary evidence that we have in either the fossil record or the DNA evidence. They have to automatically assume that the mutation rate can only get us back to 6,000 years. They have to assume that God created different kinds of organisms instead of all organisms originating from a common ancestor. They have to forego actual scientific knowledge in order for their position to make any kind of sense. And then they just have to draw a cloud in the sky and label it magic in order to explain everything. But to round out this particular part of this classroom video, the mitochondrial DNA doesn't pose any kind of problem for evolution. What the mitochondrial DNA can point us to is the earliest ancestor that we inherit our mitochondrial DNA from. And you know what? The Y chromosomal atom lived even farther back than that, showing that this is just the earliest individual that we can actually trace our lineage to. And none of that is going to affect the evolutionary process or the explanations for the diversity of life on this planet that don't include a magical wizard in the sky. I'm going to have some resources down below if you want to learn more about epigenetics as well as other topics that we covered in this video. But basically, you don't have to be an evolutionary biologist or an expert in genetics or anything like that in order to know that Genesis Apologetics is just pulling shit out of their ass. They're regurgitating common creationist tropes to a new generation of people on the internet. They are indoctrinating people into ignorance, and that is what is contributing to a lot of the ills that we have today. Genesis Apologetics is a net negative on society, and we should all push back against them every time they put out a piece of propaganda like this.